In this video, we are going to get somewhat more deeper into some lifecycle methods, and we will also see its corresponding details inside functional components. So let's start with class-based components, where a class-based component greeting2 is there, and that greeting2 is being passed a prop Alex, and that is being rendered here, right? So as usual, you can see that this is being rendered. Now let's say what we want to do is that the same name or greeting, let's say we want to put here also in the title, in the document title. So right now you can see that React app is there, and in case you are wondering from where this React app is coming, this is coming from, in the public folder you have this index.html. so this has the skeleton HTML, and this is the part where actual React app is inserted. But the skeleton app also has head where title React app is there, and that's what gives the title through this document React app. Okay, but let's say we want to change that, and we know that we can change that programmatically using JavaScript. So what we can do is that as soon as, let's say, the component mounts, we want to change the document's title to this thing, let's say the same thing, hello, and the name of the prop name which is coming here, right? So that can be set something like this. Okay, so you can see that now the title is programmatically changed. So earlier when it was not there, then this was this, but as soon as the component here, as soon as the component mounts, then after that this is being set to hello Alex. Okay, so as you can also see that when I refresh, then it is React app, but as soon as the page mounts, it changes to hello Alex, because in the component mount thing we mentioned this, that we have to change the title. Now let's do one thing, that let's change this name. So this name right now is static, which is Alex is fixed. Let's say there is some button, and when we click that button, then the prop which is passed should change. This prop.name should change. Okay, so for that we can simply take this and create a new variable, let's say called name, and this is a function component. So let's have a state name and set name, and then we are going to use state with the initial value of Alex. So right now initially still it will be Alex, so this is fine. But let's say now we have a button, and when we click that button, then let's say we are changing the name. Okay, so let's say on click we call a function change name, and this change name is again a function which handles the actual change of the name. Okay, and what does this do? It simply sets this to let's say Bob. Okay, and then you can see that when I click, then this becomes Bob. Okay, but again if I click, then it remains Bob. Okay, so let's try to do somewhat more generic implementation rather than this hard-coded thing. So let's say we have a list of names, and let's call that names, and it has a few, let's say Alex, Bob, and let's say one more name, let's say, so sorry, so this each and every name has to be a separate string, something like this, Alex, Bob, and let's have a one more name, let's say Charlie. So these are the three names, and what I want to do is that let's say name is initially so initially this thing was name. So what we can do is that rather than name being a variable. Now let's change this variable to some, let's say simply value, which essentially contains the index of this names, which means that something like this value, and this starts with 0, and initially so our name will be basically names value. So you understand, names is an array. Initially the value is 0, so this is 0, which means that names 0 is Alex, so Alex is passed. What I want to change is that with when change name is called, then let's say this value is incremented by 1. Okay, so earlier that value was whatever v, now that value is v plus 1. Okay, so it will mean that when I click once, this 0 will become 1, which means that my value will become 1, and this will become names of 1, which means Bob. Again, if I click, that value will become 2 and it will become Charlie. Okay, so you can see that when I click, it becomes Bob, when I click, it becomes Charlie, but when I click again, that thing is gone, because now the value is 3 and names 3 is not there. So what we want to do is that rather than keep on incrementing it, we want to take modulus of it, right? Modulus of it with names dot length. So we know that when we take modulus with names dot length, then the answer will be in the 0 to names dot length minus 1 range, which means that let's say this names dot length is 7, or let's take this example only 3, and when names dot length is 3, then when you divide anything by 3, then your answer is going to be, the remainder is going to be in the range 0 to 2, which means that when it will become from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3, when it will become 3, then 3 mod 3 will again become 0, so it will keep on wrapping around. Okay, so that is how it is going to be: Alex, Bob, Charlie, and then back to Alex. Okay, so it works fine from this side, which means that when I keep on clicking the value, the prop getting passed to this side is changing. Okay, but if you remember, this is hello Alex, but when I click, this becomes hello Bob, but this still remains hello Alex. It is hello Charlie, it is not changing, right? So why is that happening? Because I'm just doing component did mount, which means that the first time only document or title is changing. Whenever this component is being re-rendered again and again, then this line is not running. For that, we know that we have another lifecycle method, component did update. So essentially we need to do exactly the same thing here also. And now if you see, then Alex, when this changed to Bob, then this also changes to Bob, and this changes to Charlie, this also changes to Charlie. So now here and here both are in sync. Okay, that is fine. Now let's try to do the same thing in function based component. So let's convert this to a function component. We are back to here where just Alex will be there, because that is all it is passed. In fact, title is also not changed because nothing we have done here, right? So here what we can do is that we can simulate this sort of thing, component did mount sort of thing. So right now we'll come back to component did update, but let's say simply component did mount, that sort of thing. We can write the same thing inside use effect, and inside that we pass a function, and the second argument is empty array, then this will behave like component did mount, and inside that we want to write props.name. Okay, so you can clearly see that now this hello Alex is working, but again the same thing, when I click again, this becomes Bob, but this does not change, right? So that is again because this thing, we know that this use effect will only run while this thing is being mounted. In order to change that and update it every time, we know that if we remove this dependency array altogether, then now this effect means essentially the effect is the function which is passed, that is now called at the mount, and after that on every re-render of this greeting component, again this effect will run. which means that every time whenever your props.name is changing or whatever, whenever it is being rendered, then the latest props.name will be set to the document.title, and that you can see here. When I click, then everything is up to date. Okay, so that looks fine. But we also know that a component does not just re-render only when props are changed, which means that whatever the props are getting passed, that gets changed, but it also gets changed when its internal state gets changed. So for example, here right now we are using function component. Here the props are getting changed, so obviously it will re-render. But if this component has its internal state and that state is changing, then also it will re-render. So let's see that also. So let's say const some count is there and some set count is there, and we are going to use a state which will start with 0, and then let's say we are just printing that. Let's say it's a count, so now it is a multiple children, so let's put that in. Yeah, so now we'll see that this count is there, but we want it to change. Okay, so in order to change it, let's have a button, and that button will call, let's say, counter, and on click, essentially what is happening is that we will call this set count, which will essentially increment the current value. Okay, so we'll see that this thing is rendered. Just for clarity, just put a new line here. Anyways, so this is fine. Now you can see that when I click counter, then this counter changes, and when I click here, then this thing is changing. Okay, that is fine. Now now let's see one thing. Let's print something here. So this is like changing document title, right? That is fine, but let's print something here. Let's say anything. Say let's say a dot dot. Okay, and let's see when does it re-render. So that will prove us that how many times this use effect is being called. So now you'll see that initially it is called, that is fine, but now whether you click, which means that name is changing, then also you can see that that use effect is running, and whenever you change counter, then also you can see that that use effect is running, and that's why this a dot dot is printed. So this is essentially this effect is running whenever this component is re-rendering, and that is expected because that's what we discussed, that whenever any dependency array nothing is passed, then it will rerun every time this effect will rerun every time this component is rendered, and that's what exactly what is happening. But that is not required. In fact, that is unnecessary for specifically for this effect. Why? Because what is this effect using? This effect is using a variable, this variable props.name. Let's say you are changing count, then how does it matter to this effect? This effect is not using count anywhere, right? So that should not be a concern for this effect. Okay, so what, there is an optimization where we can say to this effect that, you know what, re-render this only when this props.name changes, otherwise don't re-render this. So sorry, which obviously it will be re-rendered, but don't run this effect. This function will not be called when count is changed. So right now you can see that when count is changing, then also it is rendering, right? But that's not what I want. So what you can do is that you can pass props.name here. So earlier we saw no dependency array, and one more thing we saw, empty dependency array. Now you can see this third thing, where I'm giving some value to that dependency array, and that's why it is called dependency array, because this effect depends on these values. If these values change, then only this effect will be run. Otherwise this effect will not be run. And that you can check it here, that now since that I have passed props.name, so you can see that initially obviously everything, all effects will run, but after that whenever I'm clicking and props.name is changing, then every time a dot dot is being printed. But if I simply increment the counter, then you can see that the counter is incrementing but nothing is being printed, which proves the point that this effect is not running. Okay, so this is what we want. And when we say that if earlier it was dependency array was empty or something, let's say for component did mount, then this is not a new case, this is just a special case. So you think it like this, that whatever is inside dependency array, if those things change, then only this effect runs after the first render. If when this dependency array was empty, that means when this dependency array was empty, that means that nothing is given here, right? Which means that after render, whatever changes, it will not re-render, and that's why it behaved like component did mount, because I'm saying specifically that this effect does not depend on any variable. That's why after first render, nothing, it never reruns again, right? So whatever is mentioned in this dependency array, whenever anything in that changes, then it re-renders. Okay, so I'll show you now with one more variable. Here you can use any variable, so let's say you can use states also, you can use prop values also, anything you can use. So right now you can see that this is hello Alex. Okay, now let's do and now you can see that when name is changing, then it is rendering, but when counter is changing, it is not rendering, right? Now let's do one thing here. Let's say that you also print count. So let's have something like this. Okay, and now you see that hello Alex 0 is happening, right? Now if you change names, so if you click, then it becomes Bob, then you see that it got ran, effect got ran. If you click again, then you can see that effect again got ran, and this name is changing, that is fine. But now if I keep on changing counter, then you can see that the counter has become 1, but the effect has not run, because I have not said here that if count changes, then you should run this. I'm not saying that, and that's why even if my count changed, then also that effect did not run. And since that effect did not run, that's why you can still see that this Charlie 0 is there, not Charlie 1. Okay, you can see that I click again, this is still Charlie 0. Now what will happen next time when I click, then you can see that this Alex is coming, but now it is coming with the latest value of count. Why? Because when I clicked and the name became name changed, props.name changed, then props.name changed, and because of props.name change, this effect ran again, and when this effect ran, then by that time the count value was 2, and that's why it took the latest value of count, which is 2. Okay, and that's why hello Alex 2 is there. And that's why again you will keep on seeing that again if you make this counter 5, then again it is Alex 2 only, but when I click again, then when it becomes Bob, then that becomes 5. That is what is happening, right? If you want this kind of behavior, that is fine, but that is what I wanted to show you by this example, that whatever you write in dependency array, that if that thing changes, if at least one of them changes, then only this thing runs, otherwise this does not run. Now you can see that there is a warning here. It is just giving you recommendation that, you know what, it is saying that you are using count inside this effect, but you have not written it, and it just shows you that if you missed it by mistake, then you can add it. Okay, so in this case we want to have the latest values, right? And that's why I'll write count, and if I now write count, then you can see that whenever count changes or props.not changes, any one of them, so at least one of them should change, then initially obviously it will re-render, initially it will render, but after that it will re-render only when at least one of them will change. Okay, and now you can see that whether I change count or I change name or I change count, in all cases this is up to date. But again, this is up to date only with respect to these two variables. It does not mean that, let's say, if you have a third variable, let's say some other state, and you change that, then again this effect will not run. This effect will only run when whatever is mentioned that changes, and that's why this is called dependency array. This effect depends on these variables, and when any of these variables change, then only it runs. If you remove the whole array altogether, then it will render every time, that we have already seen. Okay, now how to do the same thing in, so we have done this, right? We have done this in in function component. Let's try to do a similar thing in class components. So let's change here to greeting 2, and now we are back into class component, and let's have a similar thing, similar like this sort of state inside class component also. So here we will have simply, and let's say we can use it inside constructor also. So count 0. So there are two ways to initialize state. One is that inside constructor you say this dot state equal to, or you simply do like this, then also it will work. Okay, and now state dot count, that is initialized with, the count variable is initialized with 0, but now I want to have this sort of a button, and apart from that we also had a div. So let's copy this both of these, and now we are going to see this, but there is nothing called count here. We have to use this dot state dot count. Okay, and there is nothing called set count here. We have to use that thing. So for simplicity, let's simply call it handle counter, and this would be better called this dot handle counter, because we are going to define it here. And let's keep it an arrow function so that we don't have to bind it in constructor. It will automatically take the this. And now inside this handle counter, what we can do is that, this I just wrote for simplicity, because otherwise the set state, if it is long, then this will unnecessarily, this line will become too long. Okay, what are we doing? We are taking a functional form of set state where we destructure count and then set count to count plus 1. Okay, so this is all we need in order to make this count 0 1 2. Okay, so that is fine, but you can clearly understand that in a similar manner, like earlier, let's here print something like B or C, then you'll see that component date update gets called every time. Every time means whenever anything changes. So component did mount is separate. Right now we just mounted it, but whether name changes, then also you can see this is printed, C is printed, or this thing is changing, then also you can see that this thing is printed, right? But we handle this situation here by writing props.name. Okay, that if props.name changes, then only change the document dot title, right? So in a similar manner, what we can do is something like this, where we can put it inside a condition. And what can be that condition? we know that previous props is being passed inside component did update, right? Then we can make use of that. If previous props dot name is not equal to this dot props dot name, which means that my props have changed. In to be precise, my props dot name has changed. If my props dot name has changed, which means whatever earlier, let's say earlier it was Alex, the new props dot name is Bob. Anything which has changed, then only I should update the title, otherwise I should not, right? So obviously here every time it will print. Let's put it inside here, and now if you see, then you will see that if counter is changing, then that is not printing, but if click is changing, then you can see that that thing is printing, right? Which means that this thing is running only when my prop is changing. And again, you could have done a similar thing, something like this. So this dot state dot count, and you can similarly use it here also, right? But again, you'll see that when I'm changing name, then only this gets changed. If I change counter, then it is not changing. When I again click and the name gets changed, then only the counter will be also updated, because whenever the counter is changing, there is no way for title to change, because this part is not running, because counter is changing, props.name is not changing, and that's why this part is not running, right? And we fix that here by having additional dependency, that either this changes or this changes. In both cases run this effect, right? In a similar case, you can write here something like this, that this or we know that previous state is also passed in component did update. Then you can check this previous state, and then if previous state dot count is not equal to this dot state dot count, which means that if my props dot name or my count state dot count, any of them has changed, then please re-render this, please run this thing, which means that update the title. And now you can see that when name is changing or counter is changing, in both cases my title is updated. Okay, so you can see that this class way of doing things is slightly verbose, which is here it is like much more concise. But anyways, in both cases how to do it, now you are aware of it. However, shifting our attention back to function component, if you remember, we earlier discussed that from use effect you can return a function also, something like whatever function you can return. Right now this function which you return is, it is guaranteed by React that we earlier saw that when this effect is okay, so let me simplify this. Earlier we saw that when empty array was there, then we knew that this will be called on unmount. Okay, in fact this thing is a generalized concept. It is not the case that it will be just run on unmount. Now since we know the generalized syntax, something like this, that now we see that this effect is not only running on mount, rather it is running on every time either of these any of the variables in the dependency array changes. Turns out that corresponding to this generalization, the time when this return function, this is also called cleanup function, when this function returned by use effect, this runs, is also determined depending on this thing. How it works is that whenever any condition is determined that now I have to rerun the effect, then the previous effects returned function is actually run at that point of time. So you understand? So what is happening is that when nothing was there, then the only point when it will be run is at unmount. But now I'm saying that that this will be run every time this effect is rerun. So let me give you an example. Let's go back to function component. So greeting 2 now, okay, and let's simply print this. Let's simply print this. So nothing, let's just print count. And we will see that count 0 is printed, right? And that is because, like, we know that first time when this is dev mode, so first time, like, one time unmounting happens. But let's now see it clearly, that now let's say if I change counter, let's say it changes to 1, then you can see that this thing is printing. This thing is printing means the cleanup function has been called with the earlier effect. The earlier effect, at that point of time, the count was 0, and that's why this is 0 printed, right? When I press again, then the new count will become 2, right? When the new count will become 2, when I click, then 1 is printing, because the effect, the last effects, this thing has 1. Okay, and we learned about the concept of capture. Okay, capture means that every time whenever this function is rendering, then this whole function is you can understand, this whole function is created again. So you can understand that this is as good as doing something like this, that like something like const my func is equal to this thing, and then you are passing that my func. You understand, right? So what is this? Every time you are creating a new function, right? So that is just an inline way of exactly writing the same thing. Okay, so even if we are writing like this, essentially this function is being created every time again whenever this function is re-rendering. And when this function is re-rendering, when you are creating this function again, then whatever is the value of, let's say, props.name or count, whatever, at that point of time, that gets captured, right? So this is how capturing in function component works, which means that whenever I change something, then the new time, the change with the change value, the new time, this thing will re-render. But what was the value with which it was earlier rendered, at that point of time, whatever the functions, whatever the values were there, those values are captured in this function, all thing. Okay, so you can see that right now, like, say I have clicked it one time, so it becomes Bob. I clicked it one time, so it becomes one, right? Now if you print here both things, so let's say you print here props.name also and count also, then you will see what will happen. That, let's say, click one time this and one time this. Now you see that right now Bob and 1, it is there. Now let's say I click again, then this has become Charlie, right? But you see the printed value is Bob 1. Why? Because before this became Charlie, the last time it was Bob and 1, which means that here the function which was returned, the value captured was Bob and 1. And when next time the effect is running as a result of this Bob being changed to Charlie, and because of this props.name is changing, that's why this effect is running. Whenever this effect is running again, if you have returned any function here, cleanup function here, then that will be called before the effect is running again. So now you can understand, when this was empty, then there is no point in running this again. Only when the component ultimately is going to be unmounted, then only it runs, right? But right now, since this is a generalized concept and I have specified when to rerun this, every time whenever this will rerun, then before this effect is rerun, the cleanup of the earlier effect is executed. And again, here also, if right now this is a setup, which means that, yeah, Charlie and 1 is there, okay, whatever, and then when component unmounts, then again one final time this thing is called to clean up. Okay, so now you understand. Okay, now you might be thinking that this might not be a good example of cleanup because we are not doing anything, we are just printing. So let's take a real example where we are doing some cleanup. For that, let's see that there is an use effect, and in that use effect we are simply doing something like this, that we are doing set interval, and in every 1 second, what we do is that uh, we essentially change the value of count and increment it by 1. Okay, so this is what we do, and again this could have been written in just one line like this. Just 1 second. So no need to write a separate, this could be implicit without colors like this also. So essentially what we are doing is that after every 1 second, and now we don't need have a button, because essentially nobody is clicking. As soon as the component is mount, so we are running this only on mount. As soon as the component is mount, this effect is running, right? But now this is the exact point where we are saying that when the component is mount, then an interval is started. But again, we should have a cleanup function, right? That cleanup function in this case will be run at unmount. So this component, when this component is removed, then you should essentially return a function which essentially does the cleanup. And how the cleanup will be done? You can simply create a, let's say, interval id, which will be returned by this, and then you can have clear interval and you can pass that id. Okay, and here also simply you can write it like this. Okay, so essentially at mount this interval is started, and whenever this component unmounts, then that cleanup thing is done, which means that the interval, if it is remaining in memory, then internally it will keep on running and it will taking on memory also, right? So avoiding memory leak and unexpected internal executions, we can clean up this. Okay, so this is what it does. Now you see that what will happen whenever I mount, automatically this count thing keeps on changing here also and here also, actually, because the count variable is changing. Okay, fine. So this is fine, but let's now try to do one thing. Let's try to do one thing. Let's say instead of using C arrow C++, like functional style, which means that essentially now every time the interval thing is running, this is the set count is running. Set count is essentially just taking the current C and incrementing it. Let's say you are doing something like this, where you are doing something like count plus 1. So now if you save and run this, you can see that 0 becomes 1, and then 1 does not increment. So do you think that this is not running? No, this is running every 1 second. But what is happening, that every time you are setting again to 1 1 1 1 1, every time this is running, this is every time setting it to 1. And why is that? Because see, the function which is scheduled in the effect is this function. When it was scheduled at mount, because there is no dependency array, which means that at mount it was scheduled. At mount, when this was scheduled and when this function was created, at that point of time, what was the value of count? 0. So 0 plus 1. So essentially you have scheduled this. After that, every 1 second this is running, but the value of count is still 0. Value of count is still 0, right? And that's why actually this 0 plus 1 0 plus 1 0 plus 1 is running, and that's why this is stuck at 1. So essentially in this case, what you have to do, that you have to pass this count as a dependency. Okay, so what is happening is that when you pass this dependency, then whenever, let's say here, okay, so whenever count changes, then you have scheduled a new effect. So let's say initially it was 0. So let's firstly see this in action. So you see refresh 0, 1, 2, 3. Now it is working fine, right? Why this is working fine? Because see, initially it was 0, that is fine. At the first effect, when it was when this was scheduled, the effect was scheduled, it has 0, which means a 0 plus 1, this is scheduled, right? After 1 second, you ran this piece of code which changed the count to 0 plus 1, which means that now count is 1. Once the count has changed to 1, count is a state variable, this whole thing will re-render. This whole thing will re-render, right? And while this whole thing is re-rendering, this effect is encountered, and it sees that whenever count changes, then you have to run this effect again. When you are saying that you have to run this effect again, which means that now again you create a new function and schedule it. But before that, let me tell you that whenever the effect is scheduled, the previous effect's cleanup function is run. So previous effect, whatever, so 0 plus 1, that thing whatever was scheduled, its cleanup function is ran, which means that that interval is now gone, which means that that is not scheduled. Otherwise two set intervals will start, right? That is not happening here. That interval is removed and a new interval, a new effect is essentially scheduled, which has a new interval, new set interval, and that at that point of time the count value is now 1, and now 1 plus 1, so essentially 1 plus 1, this is scheduled for to be run after 1 second, which means that essentially at t is equal to 2 seconds this will run. Okay, and again at 2 is equal to 2, when this thing will become 2, then again t is equal to count is equal to 1's cleanup function that will be called, and again a new schedule will happen. And that's why you are saying that there are not at one point of time only one interval is running at one. So you can see that at one point of time only one interval is running. That's why the gap is only always 1 second. So it might be difficult to understand initially, but as a rule of thumb, simply you understand that whenever you schedule a effect and it has a cleanup function, whenever that effect runs again, and that is decided by what is the dependency array, whenever that effect runs again, the previous scheduled effect's cleanup function is firstly runs, and then the new effect runs. If you want to prove that here, you can simply do something like this. You can simply do something like this, that let's say log, and let's say, I don't know, let's say cleanup, and just this cleanup is happening on what count, you can just print that also. So when the cleanup is called, at that point of time what was the count, you can see that. If you refresh, then you can see that this, you can see clearly that this when it is 6, then you can see that the previous count is happening, right? So if you see carefully, when this is 12, then this is 13, when this is 14, then this is 15 at that moment. Why that is happening? Because when this is 18 and it is 19, because the next count is here running, okay, and the previous cleanup is done, and that's why you'll always see that this thing is a trailing one. If this thing 30, this is 29. That is because of that only. Okay, so anyways, if you just think about it and just do some practice, then it will be more clear. But as a rule, I suggested you that whenever use effect runs multiple times, then if it returns some cleanup function, then the next time firstly that cleanup function runs from the previous schedule, and then the new effect runs. Okay, so for now let's comment this, and again you can do the same thing if you want in class based component also. And okay, so why not, let's do that in class based component also. So let's change that here to 2. Okay, and what to do, we can have so what we were doing here, we simply had a timer, right? So let's remove this handle counter here, and essentially we are going to have a set timeout, at the time of the mount. So right now let's have a simple at the time of mount. Okay, so set interval, not timeout, set interval, and that set interval, after every 1 second I am going to call this thing, and essentially let's do this thing in this thing. Okay, and again when component will unmount, then essentially we need to clean up. Now again, here it was pretty simple, right? I just had a interval ID and just cleaned up that, right? But now in order to have this interval ID here, I need to save it here, right? This can be done by something like this dot interval ID, which means that in some field of the class instance I stored that, so that later I can retrieve that. Okay, so here you can see that now it is also working fine. Okay, now let's do one thing. What earlier we did here, right? So instead of C arrow C plus 1 or whatever count or function version of this, let's change this. So you understand, I was claiming that now this is running on every count change. Okay, so why is that necessary? Is that necessary here also? It will be much more clear. Okay, here. So let's do one thing, that rather than doing this, we simply set non-functional style, where I simply take the current this dot state dot count and I do +1 and set it. And you can see that this still works. This still works, right? So it does not require something like this. Why is that the case? Why is that the case? So you can see what is happening. What is happening is that whenever this set interval is called, then actually the count value is derived from this dot state. Okay, so there is no value of count which is captured. This dot state has the latest value of count, latest value of the count in that I'm not using functional style, so there is no race condition that will not be handled. But still, this dot state dot, whenever this state interval is called after every 1 second, then this thing will have at the end of every 1 second, this will have whatever the current count is. So which means that, let's say at t is equal to 1, I changed it to 0 plus 1, so which means that count is 1. At t is equal to 2, when again this thing is running, right, this thing is already 1, not 0. Okay, because when I do this dot set state, this dot state is modified, and in the next interval execution I am reading the count from this dot state, and that's why it is getting the constant value, the current value. Now let's try a few things. Let's try to do something like this: const let's say const count is equal to this dot state, and let's do something like count plus 1. Let's see whether it works or not. You can see that this also works. And why this also works? Because, okay, again you are trying to get this value from inside of set interval, and we know that set interval will have the latest value, of not the latest value, since we are using this dot state. This dot state always has the latest value, and we are trying to get count from this dot state while we are executing the function. That's why this works, right? Let's try to do now this thing, something like this. So what we did, we extracted the count value here, and now this set interval thing is running after every second. But now let's see what happens. Now see that 0 becomes 1, and then now that 1 is not changing. So now that behavior is coming, whatever was happening here, that if I did not write count, then it was stuck at 1, that behavior is coming here. So you have to conceptually understand actually what is happening, because if you write code and later if you're getting some error or let's say unexpected behavior, then you can only analyze when you understand the scenarios, that at what place what are you doing, and then why that, how that is impacting the code. Here what is happening, that in the component did mount, first time this dot state dot count was 0, so this count is 0. That count, that value 0 is extracted in a new variable called count, and now that new variable is used in the set interval callback, which means that after every 1 second this function will be called, where this count is what, where this count is the value captured here, and as a result of closure this will always be, because this component did mount ran only once, which means that in this context count is 0 still. So it is running every time, this is running at after every 1 second this is running, but in the closure of this, whatever count is there, that count is still 0, right? Because this is count, this is not this dot state dot count. So this dot state is changing, that is fine, but this count is not changing, right? Because count is a separate variable which was initialized using the initial this dot state dot count. Okay, so that's why it is stuck at 1. So you might be wondering that, okay, how to solve this problem in this case, in this scenario. First of all, it was not a problem, we unnecessarily created a problem here, right? But then let's say, yeah, whatever problem is created, how to solve this problem? What we can do is that we can do again here the same thing. So if my previous state and current state, which means that the this thing is not matching, which means that there is a difference in count, which means that count has changed, then I can do the similar thing in this. But before I do that, I already have this total interval ID, right? So why not I clean up? Clean up means I should clean up here. So you understand what has happened. Whenever the count is changing, a previous set interval was scheduled, I clear that set interval and then I create a new set interval. Okay, and essentially this thing, as the count is changing every time, this piece of code will keep on running, and eventually at the end, when this component unmounts, then a final cleanup, whatever the current interval is there, that interval is cleaned up. Okay, so now you can see that this is working fine, and this is the scenario which you have to compare with this thing. When you were trying to understand this, then you might be thinking that, yeah, why I am cleaning up interval whenever the count is changing. That is similar to this thing, that since your set interval does not have the latest value of count in this case, and that's why whenever your count changes, then you remove the previous interval and create a new interval, because this count is now going to be capturing the new value of count, and that is what is happening here, right? This interval is now capturing the new value of count because the count is changed. Whenever the count again changes, then again, so let's say like count is now 5, so 5 plus 1 whatever, something that is scheduled. Okay, and now it becomes 6. Whenever it becomes 6, then again 5 is not equal to 6, this thing will come, and again with count that 5 plus 1 whatever that was scheduled, that you clear that, take the new value, what is 6, and then you set interval, you do schedule a new set interval with like that 6 plus 1 or whatever. Okay, so in that manner, every time the count is changing, the earlier interval is cleaning up, and again a new set interval is being set up, and all of that is being done seamlessly. Okay, but you might compare this scenario with this, but again in class based component, since that sort of capturing does not happen, because this dot props and this dot state has always the latest value, and that's why you can get away with that in class based component if you directly use this dot state dot count directly here. Okay, so that is not needed, and similarly simply this will also work in this case. Okay, so yeah, if you observe closely, then
whatever situations in which we have used previous props and previous state, that is just for a comparison that it has changed or not. So previous props dot name and current props dot name, or previous state dot count or current state dot count, are they same or different? Only that thing is there. We have not used exact value of, let's say, previous or current, right? So which means that let's say uh, let's say our requirement is something like this, that we are interested in the exact value of previous state dot count or previous prop dot count, which means that let's say we have something like if previous state dot count, let's say, is equal to 3. Okay, then you can see that if previous state dot count is equal to 3, then we do something. So let's say we have something more. So let's say const some character, let's say heart character we are trying to create. Okay, and if this thing is equal to this, then we are having a character of heart. So that heart character emoji can be found on Emojipedia. So let's say something like this. So if it is previous is all actually it count is exactly 3, then we have this. Otherwise uh, otherwise otherwise we have empty string. Okay, so this is the scenario. This is not plus, this is question mark. Okay, take this heart and use it here. So let's say we simply want to use it here. Okay, so now what will happen is that, yeah, everything will work as expected. We are still using class based component, and whenever the previous, so when the previous count will become 3, then the current count will become 4. Okay, which means that whenever the current count will be 4, then the previous count will be 3, and then at that point of time a heart should come. Okay, so let's see that. So you can see that this is 1 2 3, and you can see that this red heart is coming and then it is gone. But when it was coming, when when it was 4, which means that the previous was 3, which means that now we are like actually interested in that value rather than simply getting a rather than simply getting a uh, proper, just that it's different or not. Now we actually need that value. Okay, and again it might be complicated logic also. So let's say previous state dot count plus this dot state dot count, this dot state dot count. If this summation is 3, then do this, otherwise don't do this. Or let's say this summation is divisible by 3, that would be a better thing. Okay, this thing is divisible by 3. Okay, so you can see that on 3 it is becoming, and then again 5 and yeah, so 8. Okay, so 8 plus 7 15, and 15 is divisible by 3. Now 14, again 14 plus 13 is 27, and 27 is divisible by 3. So you can understand that whenever the things are divisible by 3, then only that heart is coming, and then it is again going away. So this sort of logic. Now this, it requires us to have exact value of this thing, previous count, or for that matter any other variable. Now we learned this in one of the earlier videos, but let's try to do that here. Okay, so let's change it to function component, and if we want to do exactly the same thing in class in function component, then that is the real problem you have to solve, because here we already know, right, exact values of previous state and previous props, right? Here we don't know. Here just in use effect we pass a value, and we just know that, yeah, just know that, yeah, things change, things are changing, but we don't know actually the previous value. Okay, so for that what we need to do is that we need to have some ref. We earlier used ref, similarly we'll use, so let's say we have previous count ref is equal to use ref. Okay, and we are going to initialize it with the current count. Okay, and then what we are going to do is that we are going to have a use effect, and in that use effect what will happen, that whenever the count is changing, previous count ref dot current is equal to count. This thing we will do. What this will do is that now in this previous count dot ref, this thing will give us the previous count. Okay, and that thing we can use here. So the same logic here we can copy paste. Okay, but instead of this previous state dot count, now we can use this dot current. Okay, and instead of so right now just let's try to do only okay, this dot state dot count is nothing but the current state. Yeah, that is fine. And let's have this yeah, let's have this. Now it is a functional component, right? So you can see that this is working fine. Okay, so we can see that clearly it works. Again, we earlier saw that we could remove this in a separate function. In fact, we can remove this in a separate function and call it something like this is called custom hook, but we'll use this later. Use previous, let's say. Okay, and in that, now this is a general concept, but still you can return this dot current, and you can pass the current count. So now you can understand that you can use this directly here, something like const prev count is equal to use previous, and then you can use the current count. And now instead of this complicated thing dot current, you can simply use this thing. Okay, and yeah, so it is a new variable, so you need to add, you can add here also. Anyways, that is not compulsory, but now you can see that this works. Okay, and anyways you can add that here also to remove just the warning, but that is fine. Okay, so now you have a fairly good idea that what is the situation and how you can use this sort of things. Just that we will learn later that this sort of thing where special functions, these are just plain functions, but these are functions in a way that they also can have hooks. So if by now if you have observed, then hooks can only be at two places. It cannot be in classes, it can only be in two places, either in some functional component or in some other function which is also a hook, and that's why its name is starting with use. All hooks, even if this is my custom hook, all hooks name should start with use, and you can use any inbuilt hooks inside functional component or inside other custom hooks. Now this custom hooks can also be used inside our functional component or anywhere else. In fact, inside other inside another hooks, custom hooks, it can be called, but again it has to be called something like this. There are some conditions for inbuilt hooks and custom hooks. Actually, these things cannot be put in some conditions. So if x is equal to 3 or something, inside this condition something, these things cannot be there. So these we will learn later, what are the rules in which should be followed, and those rules are followed by all hooks, whether they are this normal hooks or custom hooks. All hooks follow those rules, that for example they cannot be put inside condition or something. But anyways, that is a matter for a separate video. This will be all for this one. Thank you.